to be real, to be authentic, is to be flawed, and that's not wrong. And to not be mocked about it. Like, it's okay to be wrong. It's about growth and learning, and that's what movies should be teaching us, is how to grow and learn in a different scenario that the story is trying to tell. I think that there needs to be a lot more movies about male characters being masculine, being protector, while also understanding that we have feelings that need to be explored out of.
Hello there.
Don't have a good day. Have a great day.
Talk to me, Goose.
I'm gonna steal the Declaration of Independence.
Why so simple?
World! I could do this all day.
Are you watching closely?
Welcome, everybody, to the One-Eyed Film Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Mossberg, and we got Will back today to talk about a very spicy topic, because we are talking about male gender roles in media, because it was inspired, I will say, from MatPat's last film theory, which happened a number of months ago. But we started talking about it in our Discord, and his last film theory was very specific to kind of a send-off. He was making the point where he, as he's watched so much media, so many TV shows, so many movies for his job, that he also now has a son named Ollie, and he's realizing the things that Ollie is watching is affecting him as role models in general, but also we would say anything you consume is going to affect you in one way or another. So that's why you need to be discerning and watching out for those things. But I would encourage anyone to go and watch it. He does have some points there about, talking about how kids start identifying with a certain gender at about 3, which again is sort of true and sort of not. I believe there's studies where around 3 is when a child starts kind of understanding who they are. When they're up to 24 months old, they're still kind of just being babies, and they're babies doing baby stuff. But around 3, they start understanding existence and other people and themselves and all that. That is true. He believes that children can pick their gender or start realizing their gender one way or the other, not physically how their gender relates to their physicality. But besides points like that, his idea of male role models in media is something that sparked conversation, and we're going to talk about it more here, because he wants to make sure his son has good role models in film. Now, I should say that from a Christian perspective, a father-son relationship should be the ultimate role model. Like, a father should be a role model to a son, correct? Obviously, Matt, as a dad, wants his son Ollie to be influenced by the media that he's watching in a good way so that he can be a better person. Again, this is a little bit interesting to make the comparison between my opinions and Matt's opinions, because he's not a Christian and I am. And he's a dad and I'm not. But we can still talk about these things. And so what Matt noticed is that a lot of media had men who were being the idiots, the not good parts of being a man. They were being the butt of the joke and not being the smart ones, not being protective. And he wanted to discover why. And there were some science studies that he brought up. Some were very interesting. The toy company Lego did a study. They wanted to discover how children play with toys, because if you're not aware, most movies and TV shows are made to sell toys. Toys are the bigger money maker than most movies or TV shows, if you can sell the kids toys. But Lego wanted to know how to sell toys better. And so they did a study where they discovered that girls, when playing with their toys, will play as though they are the characters. They are playing as Barbie. They are interacting in the world they've created. Whereas boys, with their monster trucks and their dinosaurs and their superheroes and all of that, are playing as a director. They're watching this unfold in front of them and thinking, that's so cool, I can have control over it. It might be a control thing, but it's built into boys from the start. Like, that is what a boy is. That was a consistent theme that they saw in their research. And so when it comes to kids shows, Matt realized that a lot of boys shows, whether it was Batman the Animated Show, or he used Phineas and Ferb as one, because Phineas and Ferb are boys, but also I know plenty of girls who like Phineas and Ferb. But they aren't necessarily good role models for being a boy. It's because boys don't need role models in their shows. Not saying they should be bad and should just be a really untethered version of boyhood or maleness. It shouldn't be that, because there should be some hold on it. Then you start looking at all the other stuff that is in media right now, all of the other versions of men that are being portrayed, and you realize that it's not really changed that much from kids shows to adults movies and stuff. So what can be done about that? I want to talk about that here. That's probably the longest intro I've ever done. William, do you have some thoughts on this to start us off?
Yeah. The first thing I would say is I think MatPat is technically Christian, or at least I think that he might identify himself, but I think he's also part of like the Universal Life Church, which is I think more universal Unitarian oriented, although don't quote me on that, but that's neither here nor there. The point being though, yeah, he made some interesting points in that last film theory video, and I think that this is kind of a product of like the way that media in general has kind of shifted, and there's kind of been like a pendulum shift, because if you look at like previous media over different decades, they're going to focus on different things, like you like the action heroes of like the 80s who are super bulked out and stuff like that, and I mean like, or in like the 1950s where you have like certain like the code friendly type of things where everything, all the good guys always win, that sort of stuff. So I think kind of what we're seeing partly nowadays, why MatPat at least seems to notice a lack of like really good fatherly figures, is partly just because there's been such a focus on like strong independent females and things like that in Hollywood and media in general. It's more of like a pendulum shift where, because you're going to focus more on that and the experience of women and stuff like that, that in some cases that's going to lead to less of a focus for good like models for boys and stuff like that. And yeah, like that's kind of like just like a general overall statement I'd say. I think like something else though is that like boyhood is very, boys tend to be a bit more action focused and stuff like that, which is why it's always like pew pew lasers and swords and action figures and stuff like literally called action figures and things like that. And like I think like just think about back into like my boyhood and stuff like that. For a lot of kids, it's what you want is to go on like an adventure and have fun with your friends and stuff like that. And that's not saying that girls don't do stuff like that, but the way that I think girls kind of do things and boys kind of do things and how they experience things in their childhood is different, and that's going to be reflected. And that I think nowadays we're having more of a focus on maybe traditionally feminine traits, like ideas like compassion and good kindness and tolerance and stuff like that. Like those types of things are being encouraged more, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but because of that, like things that like, you know, just going on an adventure with your friends and stuff like that tends to be, I think, a bit more, maybe not so much the adventure part, but it kind of making sense that like it's the idea that like there's certain like things that are being more encouraged within modern media, and things that like that's not quite as appealing, for example, for boys per se, or for some boys per se. And that also might lead into like the idea of like fatherhood and stuff like that, where people try to like, again, I think it's kind of like just a pendulum shift, like we're trying to focus more on the experience of like mothers and things like that, and experience of women and stuff like that, and that has led to a less degree of focus for good male role models and like good fatherly figures and stuff like that in media.
No, I see what you're saying. No one can deny that there has been a shift in how movies are made and even marketed to really push towards the strong female character. And that's something kind of that the Critical Drinker says a lot, is strong female character. And it can get very annoying to have that be the main point of a lot of movies. I was going to talk about it later, but I can bring it up now. We need characters, male and female, to be both strong and sympathetic. That's just being human. That should just be human. But also, men being strong is very different from women being strong. That's because God created us differently in our own unique roles. We're talking about male roles in media, and that's just a parallel to male roles in how we were created to be. So what is intended for us now versus what is being shown and what we are told to be. And maybe some people will say, oh, it's toxic masculinity. Oh, it's just a hiccup in how we've decided that we're going to be approaching these things. I think that men not being strong or sympathetic, or just not having one, is a problem too. So if you're just if a character is just a strong man, then he has no heart. And maybe that's kind of a John Wick scenario where he's still sympathetic because of his dog and his wife, but he just doesn't have any heart for killing all these people. I'm sure there are other examples, but mostly that might be just a superhero mentality of just strength, no sympathy. And then there's the opposite, where if men are just sympathetic, then they're not really strong, they're not really a protector, and that kind of creates a weak man. And that might be more of a laughing stock, I suppose, in some stories, I suppose. With women, they can be strong for sure when it comes to like a mama bear mentality. Never get mixed up in a mama bear situation, but that's often where I would support a quote unquote strong woman in a film, is if it's a protection of child or loved ones or things that you love. Like, that makes sense. A strong woman is not a man. I think you made that joke in a different episode where it just seems like strong women are just men because they're trying to be not women, which apparently is sexist to themselves because they're saying they need to be something that's not natural and that's super muscular and able to take down anybody even if they're twice their size. Like, that's not how women were created. Not to say they can't for some people, but the majority ekes out over the rest of this. And of course, I would say women should be sympathetic. They are better at that, I would say, than men. But it's not saying that they shouldn't be at all. I believe that there are plenty of strong women characters these days who don't show sympathy. I would say Rey Skywalker is one of those.
Rey Palpatine. Rey Skywalker.
She's a strong woman and doesn't really feel feelings. She's just kind of a blank slate of emotions. And other characters that just don't, there needs to be balance. And that's just showing humanity for what it actually is. I think we'll get to that more in a little bit.
Well, I think kind of what you're picking up is like two extremities of masculinity. And I think this might be another thing we can focus on. We've talked about this on other episodes, I believe, as well. But I wouldn't say our culture is anti-masculine. It probably depends on where you are and who you're with and stuff like that. But there's certainly, I think the certain ideas of masculinity are less prevalent and less encouraged. And because of that, or at least more suspicious or seen more as suspect nowadays, and that might lead into that as well. But I think kind of what you're kind of digging up is like the idea, like, what do people call them? Like alphas versus betas, I guess. That's that slang term, whatever. But it's the idea of like, you have like the alpha Chad who's like super strong. He's all about this and that thing and gets whatever he wants. And there's variations on that theme, but that's the idea of like masculine strength, but with like, again, no sympathy, no self-restraint and self-control. But then you have like the inverse of that, which is the essentially like somebody who has zero strength, zero capabilities, and is more spineless, and essentially just like gives in to everything. And they might be good-hearted, they might be compassionate and loving or whatever, but they have no capacity for strength or protection or anything like that. And I think that what you really want, more or less, and what MatPat was kind of trying to dig into a little bit, is like somebody who can combine the aspects of masculine strength, but also self-restraint and responsibility and the capacity to offer up that strength for the sake of others, which is essentially the ideal of a father or a fatherly figure, someone who uses their capacities to give up for the rest of the family, for the rest of their children and their wives and stuff like that. And yeah, and if you're talking about something like that, honestly, yeah, I can see why doesn't seem to be a whole lot of like very good like masculine figures in regards to like fatherhood. Probably like the best one that comes to mind for me, at least immediately, is Vander from Arcane. But like, I don't know how prevalent that is. But I think it also just like, I think what's also really interesting though is think about the ideas of like boyhood. And I think this also relates into how children are raised nowadays. I think you and I are going to have some limited experience in this because you're homeschooled and I wasn't homeschooled, but I was raised on a farm, and so I'm kind of like honorarily homeschooled. Because in the sense that, in my childhood, like you grew up on a farm, so you go out and you do stuff. Like I climbed trees, I built tree forts, I dug around in junk and stuff like that and see what I could build with things like that. And so it's more of like an adventurous childhood and stuff like that. And I think that's kind of what's somewhat lacking for a lot of boys and stuff like that, where a lot of times like you have like helicopter parents who are just constantly protecting their children or shielding them from everything, and everything has to be made safe and secure and on playgrounds and things like that, and like coddling it and that sort of stuff. So, and I feel like that might tie also into children's media as well, where you'll have like, I don't really watch kids shows, so I can't really speak too much, but and I feel like this kind of might just tie into like children's media as well, where it's a lot more focused on ideas of like being respectful and like, it's sad that you're hurt and things like that, and trying fixing things, and there's all like, again, like good aspects to that, but I think it's the idea that like a lot of boys, just what gets them excited is the idea of like going on a quest together with fellow boys and like bonding over that and having an adventure and something like that, kind of like in like The Hobbit, where that's like a classic example of the idea of like the questing archetype and things like that, where and like you don't necessarily want rambunctious boys, but like the way that boys like to do things is different than girls. And I've already mentioned this, but I think that's, again, like, and we focus on things that like girls might like to do more in media, which is like, talking and socialization and things like that, whereas boys tend to be more action oriented, and that tends to be a discrepancy.
Yeah, and MatPat's point was that the examples he brought up, he said that yes, a lot of these shows are fun and good and entertaining, but when it comes to like Phineas and Ferb, they're disobeying their parents all the time. And that's the point of the show. But he said that his son didn't want to watch Phineas and Ferb anymore because he didn't like that they were getting in trouble, or he thought that they would get in trouble and didn't want to really like watch it anymore, which is fine. Or like Jimmy Neutron kind of being a jerk to all of his friends and to girls and all that. Like those shows sometimes don't portray all the best things. Whereas then he brought up like Bluey and Thomas the Tank Engine. Is it Tank Engine or Train? What is this?
Thomas the Tank Engine. If it's not, my childhood is ruined.
It is the Tank Engine? Yeah, it is. You're right. And then he brought up other examples of good versions of characters who both were entertaining and taught good lessons, like Bluey. Bluey's a girl, but their dad is also a great role model. Thomas the Tank Engine is entertaining and also has good values. Or like Daniel Tiger, where Daniel the Tiger is likable and a good kid and still teaches good lessons. But even then, I think boys would rather watch Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles instead of that. I'm just saying that would be my preference if I had to choose between those two. And it's interesting. The one thing I started thinking about is, how does this apply to our Christian belief of manhood? I'm thinking specifically about the role models in TV shows, more or less, that end up being the men being the butt of the joke. And it kind of, and the immaturity that is shown, especially when we start talking about the media that's not geared towards kids. And I think of 1 Corinthians 13:11. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. And I feel like that's not been represented well in our media. The shows that are very popular often portray a poor example of a father figure, whether they're failing, whether they're, like I said, the butt of the joke, whether they're the idiot. They have not given up childish ways. And sometimes that's just comedy. Sometimes you can't help it, but I still think that you can have comedy and realism without mocking. I don't think you need to mock in order to have comedy. And that's what a lot of people, a lot of directors, a lot of producers think need to happen with these shows. When the show is a comedy and the dad has a lot of jokes that can be made about them, it's more mockery instead of well-crafted jokes. Like, there can be comedy and respect at the same time, is my point.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's like the stereotype of like the deadbeat dad, which is like the Simpson thing, and I think the Family Guy thing as well, although that one's, I don't really watch those either so much, so I can't speak of it too much, but it's kind of like that stereotype in regards to that. When it comes to like the ideas of like, you know, how men and boys are portrayed in media and like, that relates to Christianity and stuff like that, and it's also like what's acceptable and things like that, you know, it's going to depend. But I think like one thing we can think about is that ultimately we can always look to the Bible for good examples and bad examples of like what not to do as well, because there's a lot of bad, terrible figures in the Bible as well that deter that as well. But I mean, I kind of just like think about, again, like thinking back to like boyhood and stuff like that, and like what boys want. And I think one thing that kind of seems to be lacking is the idea like, if you do portray boys as rambunctious, it's always like immature, and like the immaturity thing is kind of annoying as well, because yes, boys can be more action focused, they can do all sorts of crazy stuff, and in some sense, and like if you want a healthy child, you generally want them to be free a little bit to do things like that, but at the same time, you also want to develop maturity and discipline and responsibility and things like that as well. I think that's also very much lacking, where ideas of like, you know, yes, you can do things, but you also should be responsible for them. And then again, this kind of goes back to what I've talked about a little bit, the archetype of like the quest or going on an adventure. And the idea for that is that you go off into the world with your friends or whatever, you bond together, you face trials, and through that you come home and you're changed, and hopefully you've grown, you've developed as a person. That's kind of like going through, that's kind of like the idea of like, you know, you go to college or you go to high school, or you go on these experiences or faraway trips and things like that in order to learn and to grow and develop as a person, as a character. And if you're a guy, as like a boy into a man. And I think that also just isn't quite as focused on as much, at least for guys specifically, because like, you know, there's often like the ideas like, we can just talk this out, or I think about like, and I do not watch a lot of kids media, so this is a really good example, but I think of like the ideas of like, for example, you know, like Steven Universe, and I'm not like a passionate person on those shows, I can't speak about it too much, but that, from my understanding, that seems to be focusing a lot more on ideas of like charity and, you know, kindness, and, you know, we can talk this out and share our emotions and stuff like that. And whereas compare that to like, you know, maybe something we watched, which is like The Last Wish, which is again that idea of the adventure and going off on that, and then you learn a lesson through that. I think like kind of one of the best examples of that is like The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which is literally about that, like him kind of doing crazy stuff, but he kind of like hopefully learns from that as well a little bit.
I think another aspect to be talking about when it comes to male role models is movies showing what men should be. And that should be in quotes, because what men should be is really defined by scriptures and by Jesus as a role model. And yet there are a lot of poor portrayals of what men should be in movies.
Yeah, and again, that goes into like the different extremities and stuff like that we've already kind of talked about, where, you know, you're either going to get like the guy being the butt of the joke, or he's going to either be like hyper masculine and like uber aggressive, and it's all about either, you know, banging women or just being super strong or whatever and buffing himself up or being egotistical or things like that. Or he's like the exact opposite, where honestly like the Barbie movie kind of has like examples of this to degrees. And again, like the biblical masculinity, I would argue is more or less focused on like the responsibility you have with the strength that you are given, or with the capacity that you're given with as the fatherly figure, as the protector of the family and stuff like that. And again, like the best example that I can think about is like Vander, because he pretty much exemplifies that, where he gives everything for his kids.
So you're saying with great power comes great responsibility.
Yes.
So when we're talking about when movies start showing what men should be or what boys should be or anything like that, it turns from not just portraying characters that men will like, because objectively I will enjoy watching Godzilla X Kong because of the monster beatdown that's happening. That's the types of movies that often men like, not saying women can't like them. These are very generalizations, but I want it to be clear that these are that I'm talking in stereotypes, not in specifics and rules, I suppose. But when it's not just portraying characters that men like, movies can also explore the fruits of what kids shows and movies lead up to, which is the portrayal of men being idiotic, rude, or violent. And I think that part of that is just a sin nature, but what should we strive for? What should the role model be? What should we aim to be like? And I don't think there's a perfect example of a male character in a movie. I just think that unless it's Jesus, which even then you're probably trying to adapt him from what we know from scripture, and that's probably a little bit inaccurate. Looking at you, chosen crew, because I've heard some different arguments for and against the chosen and how they choose to portray Jesus, and that's not the discussion for now. But even that, when you're trying to portray the most perfect man ever, it's not going to work, because we're still flawed and our understanding of things are flawed. So there is no perfect man. But I would say one movie that I'll list a few movies here in a bit, but I would say that one movie that really does male and female roles at the same time pretty well is Tangled, which is really interesting because Tangled is probably the part of the peak of my Disney viewing as a kid. And then there was Frozen, and then it kind of went down from there. But Rapunzel is a girly girl who likes all the things you'd expect, but she's also brutal with her frying pan in self-defense and physical against Mother Gothel and others when confronted about it. So she's got a lot of sympathy, and she's got her stereotype as a girl, and then she also knows how to be strong. Flynn Rider, with the smolder, is an easygoing fighter who fights for what he thinks is right, which changes throughout the story. He goes from wanting selfish things to fighting for Rapunzel, and he helps protect her. And he also has a tragic backstory, and he allows himself to feel things for the girl that he now likes. Yeah, so that's that dichotomy of strong and compassionate that both characters need to have in their own right. They have both strength and compassion, and they express themselves in different ways because they are different. Men and women are different, if you can believe it. Did you know that? So I saw you making faces when I brought up Tangled. Did you have a thought?
No, I'm just kind of surprised because it's not that you like it. It's just that's like an older film. It's like I would not have expected you to pick Tangled as like what you consider a perfect one. But I mean, I guess I can see it mostly for the most part. I think what's also interesting about Tangled though is that what changes the guy? It's the girl, and this is kind of like another bit like the love story type of thing where or this is very common in like what is it, like the bad boy type of stories where it's like I can't do it, babe. Actually, hold on. It's like the stereotype. It's like the stereotype of the bad boy romances that are very popular. I know because my sisters have them. It's like it's like the scary hulking guy and who's probably has a six pack for some reason, and then he meets like the girl. He's like, oh no, I fallen in love. I'm gonna protect you, and like that whole thing. But it's the idea that the guy is changed by the girl, and this goes into the complementarian view of men and women. How men can like do stuff without women, and women can do stuff without men. But it would be a really terrible world if one of them didn't exist. And there's the idea that like Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this, where it's the idea like Beauty and the Beast uses as an example, where you have like the monstrous capacity and strength within the guy or the man, which is the beast, but then it's tamed, so to speak, and pacified in a certain sense by the gentleness and the compassion and the love of the woman. And for the sake of that love, the guy changes and the beast, so to speak, changes. And this is kind of what happens in Tangled, where you have somebody who's selfish and only in it for himself, at least initially. But then because of like attachment to something else, to Rapunzel, and his love for her, he changes entirely. And he even ends up kind of like dying sort of for her. And she ultimately revives him back. So I think that's another interesting kind of like good example about that. But yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but it works.
Yeah, I just heard a sermon from R.C. Sproul, who broke down the declaration that God made in creation when he said, it is not good that man should be alone. That is the first thing that God saw in his perfect creation that was not good. And it was not good because God understood that there is something that man needed that God could not give him. I mean, he did give it to him, but as in the relationship between God and man had something lacking, and that was a true partner. And that partner was woman. That's who he created to complement the man. And therefore the woman also gains something from the man, from her relationship with the man. Like it's a team. It's a team that makes so much sense. And it's so beautiful. It's so great to understand that that's how God created it to be. I do want to talk about a few characters and what is a bad example of a manly man in movies. I think a really interesting movie to talk about masculinity is Fight Club, and its exploration of Ed Norton's character, which I just realized didn't have a name. I thought it's the same as Tenet, where it's just kind of a nameless protagonist. But the narrator in Fight Club is searching for a speck of masculinity and finds it in Tyler Durden's character. And I'm going to try not to spoil anything as I continue talking about Fight Club because it's a pretty interesting movie. But the director of Fight Club said something that encapsulates masculinity in modern media and why we're so attracted to the male superstar, I believe. He said, "We're designed to be hunters. We are in a society of shoppers. There's nothing to kill anymore, nothing to fight, nothing to overcome, and nothing to explore. In that societal emasculation, this everyman is created." And again, that is the essence of Fight Club. It's supposed to be all of these people in business and in their desk job, in their 9 to 5. They secretly need a way to punch it out. They need a way to get it out and just deal with it instead of just talking about it. I don't think that's the right way. I'm not advocating for Fight Club, but he is right in saying that we are designed to be one way, and society kind of has pushed that way down. Like the way we are meant to operate really doesn't fit with our society now. And I don't know how to unpack that with a Christian worldview, because we want to strive for one thing, and yet what is the practicality of striving for that thing? And that thing that I'm trying to be abstract about is masculinity in this case. You have any thoughts on that quote?
Well, that's a really interesting one. I'd say that there's a good deal of truth to that because, again, guys are designed for a certain thing. And historically speaking, we live in a very strange period. And I would argue that there's a lot of parts about modernity that make people go crazy in general because of just how different it is like compared to like how our ancestors lived. Because like, you know, most of your life, traditionally speaking, you'd be like living in smaller communities with a tighter connections with people, often like either a family or clan structure. And regardless of like how tough or terrible life is, there's generally speaking something you have to do, something you have to live for. Whereas like nowadays it's a bit different because again, like that quote is all about like, well, what do men have to live for? That's the big question. What do we have to fight for, so to speak? Because men, you know, at the heart of every guy is a warrior. There's a really good video by Redeem Zoomer which talks about like why men are lonely, and I think we'll link this in the description. But it really kind of talks about how like men need something to fight for and something to work for, and if you don't give it to them, like they kind of feel aimless because we need to feel something to do. Again, that kind of ties to the idea of the call of adventure. You're going on an adventure, you're doing something, you're exploring, you're fighting. And like what kind of traditionally have men fought for? Well, it's either been for the family, it's been for the faith or a religion, or it's been for like the nation. And like nowadays, most guys don't feel they don't feel like they're really called or driven or capable of fighting for anything like that. So I think that's kind of tied to like male loneliness and stuff like that, which is a whole different topic. But I think that encapsulates a very poignant note that a lot of guys feel aimless and driftless, and that is somewhat reflected in media because our media doesn't really provide a lot of like catharsis for the idea of like going on an adventure, fighting something, working for something, exploring something, doing something like that. And if you don't have that, well, then we kind of feel a bit more aimless and stuff like that, which is why it would definitely make sense for people who would just like work a 9 to 5 every day in a desk job are kind of going to go a little crazy and want to maybe just take a chance at doing it at a fight club, because then you feel more masculine in that sense in a society where you can't really express yourself like that.
I think there's a physical need for all men that is probably festering in a lot of guys, because not too long ago, almost all work was with your hands. There was not a lot of business to be had. It was more rare to have a job where you're sitting down with a book and making sure everyone had insurance or whatever. I'm thinking like in the 1800s, like there was probably some sort of insurance company back then. There were bankers, there were things like that. But for the most part, in the 1800s, you had a physical labor job. And there's plenty of that still around. You work on a farm with your family right now. And so it's not to say that it's completely gone, but the normal is now to live in an office for your job and to work that 9 to 5 without getting that physical movement out, I guess. And that's where some men find their passion in the gym, where they can build their body and get that physical movement out. And yeah, exercise is important to anyone, but I still think that that's kind of where Fight Club came from, is that you need some way. It was almost a therapy to those guys in the movie, but it's a very interesting look at masculinity, and I feel like we might do a whole episode on that in the future. I don't know. It could be interesting. I also want to point out that the themes in Fight Club were probably are mirrored in other movies like American Psycho, Nightcrawler, Taxi Driver, and Drive. This is coming from a video essay that I'll link in the description that talks about the literally me trend that goes around. It's like when it's been a joke, especially with Ryan Gosling, where he's like, he's literally me. It's still having that high energy, high action type of character while also delving into who they are and what makes men tick. And those movies do that well. The video that this is all inspired from is linked in the description if you want to check that out. But I think he makes a good point with all those different movies and explains how they all describe manliness, but too much of one aspect of it. And that's like the action part. Go watch the video. It's a very interesting topic that it breaks down. I think it's also hard seeing the bastardization of old characters. I think seeing them once be strong and then be weak can be a good storytelling move, but I don't think that's what they were going for. The few I have listed are Luke Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Thor, and Hulk. They were once very respected characters and people loved them. And then their reiteration into the new forms of media has kind of shown them to their older selves or their adapted self to be very different. Luke Skywalker was the one who blew up the Death Star and really had hope for the Jedi way and had a big success at the end of Return of the Jedi, and then the next time we see him, he's a crabby old hermit. A lot of people have said that doesn't fit his character. Even Mark Hamill says that doesn't fit his character. Obi-Wan really kind of took the same route, where even though he had suffered a loss at the end of Revenge of the Sith, in his own show, he really lost all hope, and that didn't really meld between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope all that well. Thor, I loved Thor in the Avengers, in his own first two movies. Even I would take the Thor from A Dark World than the Thor we have in Ragnarok and beyond. I don't think Taika Waititi's Thor does really well. He's just a completely different character. I don't like it. And the Hulk was great in Avengers and all the Avengers, not just Avengers 1. And now he's just Professor Hulk, and there's nothing interesting about him because he doesn't smash anymore. In Endgame, he made that jump to be Professor Hulk, and then he's just kind of like, "Rrr." It's not entertaining to have Hulk if he's just going to be smart. So I don't know, characters like that really have been ruined by this new push to emasculate men. Basically, that is the gist of it. It's putting men low and making women better. Which again, I don't think the feminist revolution was all bad. I think there are a lot of great things that came from it, such as rights and the ability to be in the workplace, things like that. But when it came to media, it really brought women up to a level that was impossible. Not impossible because it was done, but impossible like outside of the realm of practicality in what women can do. And that is not like allowed to do. Does that make sense? Like, it's not like they're not allowed to do anything. It's that what is their capability? And that I'm thinking mostly of the girl boss who can just do anything the right way immediately, or the action star who can take down a WWE wrestler without trying at all. Like, that's not practical either. So that almost went too far, not only making that an impossible reality of women being insane superheroes that is not in the realm of reality, but also it brings men down to the point of being idiots. And I don't think that has done anything good for the role models in our movies. I'm sure somebody will hear what I'm saying and say, oh, so you think women can't be superstars and take down a guy bigger than her, but you can think that Captain America can punch a purple alien in the face or something like that? There is some suspension of disbelief. Like, yes, you can suspend your disbelief for something extra worldly happening, but I still think you need rules to your universe. And I personally think that God created this universe to be good, and that includes differences in men and women. So when you just have a woman doing the exact same thing a man can do, it's very different. I believe there's a scene in The Witcher. Again, I haven't watched The Witcher. I just know that the scene exists, is that there was a woman who was caught in the midst of a battle and she was really struggling. She was holding her own as much as she could, but she didn't have the upper hand over the men who were fighting against her until Geralt came in and He did save her, but it's not like she wasn't a damsel being like, oh, help me, God. She was fighting. She was strong in the biggest way a woman could be strong in that moment. And then Geralt came in with his sword and hacked the guy's head off or something like that. So having realistic rules for your universe makes the most sense. And you're going to connect more with your audience if you make it based in our universe instead of being complete fantasy and having no basis in our world, if that makes sense. There's also a conversation to be had about war movies like 13 Hours or Hacksaw Ridge. Like those movies, I watch them and I'm like, I feel very manly and inspired. I don't know why. Something about war brings it out in you, and yet it terrifies me. Like I never want to go to war, but those movies bring you into it, and you feel the same thing that those men were feeling in both of them. Like Hacksaw Ridge talks about Desmond Doss's passion for saving his brothers that he's made in the army and the sorrow of losing them and stuff like that. And 13 Hours is all about the companionship that they have, the brotherhood, and fighting for that. There's even, then you get into the characters like Jack Reacher or John Wick. They're kind of all buff. And those are characters that are attractive because you want to be like them. But why? It's a very interesting conversation to have.
There's been a certain degree of pushing certain, like, more or less, I don't want to say feminine traits, but basically that in a lot of like media, and that's kind of having this effect on how portrayals of guys are being depicted. And I say that to the extent that I think that if you notice like how certain medias in the past depicted guys versus how they depict them now, that's going to be different. Or just the fact that, like, I think there's a lot of like TV shows and movies that are, for lack of a better term, more emotional, or they often focus on like the emotion behind characters and like, you know, how people are feeling, and people just need to talk it out and that'll solve issues. Like I'm not a Star Trekkie, but like I've seen parts of like old Star Trek, and like you know, there's often times where like, you know, people just like have to like hold it in, hold back the tears and stuff like that. Whereas nowadays I think there's more of a push to be like, oh, let's just have the characters be expressing themselves and talking about their issues. And there's a degree to where stoicism is not good. But at the same time, there's also a degree to where just like, you know, being frivolous about things and is not good either. And just like, oh, let's just talk about the emotions. Let's just sort it out and talk about our feelings and things like that. And I think that for a lot of guys, like the idea of like, you know, talking about your feelings and stuff like that, like that's less appealing. And so when characters are more pushed to be like that, it's like less interesting as well. So I think there's just all like different like things that are bubbling together that divide into like how boys and guys are being portrayed, and you know, whether or not that's good or not, and things like that. So ultimately, I think it's just more discernment. Like there's always like some good stuff you can find, even if there's characters who are not what men should be like, they can still be good characters. Like I think going back to the Arcane thing, like we all love Silco as a character, but he's not a good person, and he's not. We've had an argument about this, but I would still say that he's not a good father, or at least not a good fatherly figure. But like you can still appreciate characters for what they are, even if they're very flawed and not good.
I'm going to end with this. We need characters, male and female, who are flawed but not mocked. To be wrong is not to be wronged. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense.
What we need to understand is that we expect characters who are flawed because everybody's flawed. But we want characters, or at least some characters, who exemplify certain virtues and ideals that are good and that you should aspire to be more towards, like even if they're not perfect, which, because again, nobody's perfect except for God.
You're right. We expect them to be flawed, but I still think that that's not what comes out of Hollywood. I think of Rey from Star Wars. She's pretty much perfect at what she does instead of going through an actual character arc. But I'm saying that to be real, to be authentic, is to be flawed, and that's not wrong. And to not be mocked about it. Like, it's okay to be wrong. It's about growth and learning, and that's what movies should be teaching us, is how to grow and learn in a different scenario that the story is trying to tell. I think that there needs to be a lot more movies about male characters being masculine, being a protector, while also understanding that we have feelings that need to be explored. Some examples that I have written down are like American Sniper, which explores what it means to be a man in war and the repercussions of that, and figuring out what that means in his own mind. Creed 3, I know, follows Adonis punching his way through a conflict. Like he's in the boxing match for a good reason, because of his passion that he's dealing with at home with his wife and family. Jake Sully from Avatar 2, I remember we talked about this a while ago. He was able to be a strong father while respecting his wife's role as the nurturing, caring mother, and working with her as a team in order to lead the family. I loved Avatar 2 for that reason. Like, that has more meaning than Avatar 1 for me, just because of the father figure alone from Jake Sully. And the women in those movies that I just listed are strong in their own right. it's not the strong woman as is said nowadays, is just the strong independent female. But they're strong in a real way, not just they're strong if they're just men. If they just act like men is how they're strong. That's not that mentality. They're strong in a real way.
I think Croods is actually another really good example. I kind of like, that's like an older one,
Ooh.
but especially in the first film where it's literally about like the big dad, and he's literally like physically big. Like he literally gives up his life essentially for his family. Or at least he's willing to give up his life, and it's kind of sweet in that. But that's another example. There's other examples as well in media that we could focus on. But
yeah, Croods is a great one. I think that's a good example. He's very protective and leading as well, even if he's uninformed, but yeah, it's neither here nor there. Thank you guys so much for listening or watching. Make sure to follow us on all our socials, linked in the description. Watch all those videos. Until next week, know that you are loved. God bless.
see ya.